Yes, indeed.
Just in time. Just in time.
Just in time. And because of my research interests in the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, I spent a lot of time thinking about radiocarbon dates and how to get better radiocarbon dates for those periods which have traditionally kind of lacked those. So I guess that's sort of how I drifted into this area of inference, as I mentioned previously to Arthur, as sort of AirSat's geochronologist. So I dabble in radiocarbon dating, but I think a lot about how to try to get better radiocarbon dates for the sites that many of us are interested in here in New England and well beyond. So with that, I guess I'll get started and share my screen and begin the PowerPoint presentation, the requisite PowerPoint presentation. All right. All right. So can someone give me a shout out if it's showing?
It is not showing yet.
It is not showing yet. All right. It worked so well when we tried. There we go.
Hey, that looks better. Yeah.
How about that? Maybe if I did it right, it would work better. All right, there we go. I can see you. You can give me a thumbs up. I assume it's sharing now. Cool. That is great. All right. So a brief overview of tonight's talk is I just want to review the background of radiocarbon dating, like how the history of the method, how it works, how we got to where we are today, because at least for me, I think that that's a useful exercise in terms of understanding why we're doing what we were doing and some of the things that you need to keep in mind about selecting radiocarbon dates and why it's now more important than ever to try to get the best radiocarbon dates you possibly can. All right. So with that, I'll just trend out of that into then just basic reading radiocarbon dates, like what they mean when you see one, and why it's important to keep those numbers in mind. And diving right into calibration of radiocarbon dates to make them accord with actual calendar dates, with actual years, as opposed to just regular old radiocarbon years, which, as you'll find out, are indeed different, as well as factors that produce inaccurate dates, things that you really need to keep in mind when you're selecting radiocarbon dates, because these factors can produce errors or you will end up dating something that you don't necessarily want to date. And then an overview of modern methods in radiocarbon analysis, Bayesian inference, and various modeling approaches to radiocarbon dates, really to illustrate some of the new methods that are being developed, and also to highlight why getting more and better radiocarbon dates, or getting better radiocarbon dates, is even more important now than it ever has been. And then finally wrapping up with a sort of primer on choosing your samples when you're in the field, when you're out there at an archaeological site trying to make sense of what you're seeing in the ground, and have to make a decision about what carbon samples to keep and which carbon samples to let go. Hopefully this will help you think about the ones that you're most interested in, or when you're pulling them out of float samples or whatever. And then finally, a recap. So moving into radiocarbon dating. So radiocarbon dating was invented by Willard Libby in 1949. So I'd like to emphasize that this is actually a relatively recent development, not just in archaeology, but in geology, and in fact, any discipline that deals in deeper time. It's only been since 1949 that we've really been able to understand just how old things are. Prior to that, dating methods relied upon relative dating, that is, how old things are in relation to each other, but you couldn't actually put a number on how old something was. We might have known that the Pleistocene existed because there were extinct megafauna in those sediments, but we didn't know whether the Pleistocene was 11,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago. It wasn't until 1949 that we were actually able to determine that and put a number on it. So it's a really, really big deal. At the University of Chicago, as part of the Manhattan Project, right? The project that the US worked on to develop nuclear weapons, but also extensively studying radiation and radioisotopes that led to the insights that would lead to radiocarbon dating as a method, right? And it was so significant that it won Libby the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1960, because it really was a profound change in our understanding of the world around us, not just for archaeology, but also, as I said, any discipline that concerned itself with time. Now, what is really cool with what Libby did, or his idea, was to just test the radioactivity, specific radioactivity produced by the decay of carbon-14, right? An isotope of carbon, right? So if you recall sort of basic chemistry, elements can have different isotopes. That is, they have the same number of protons, but different numbers of neutrons. And if you have usually heavier isotopes, they will tend to decay with radioactive decay. And with Libby's insights from the Manhattan Project, he tested that hypothesis against objects of known age, right? So starting with trees that you could count the rings back and be like, oh, well, this Douglas fir tree is 500 years old. This redwood is 2,500 years old. But then also objects, archaeological objects that actually had dates written down, right? So Ptolemaic coffin and Egyptian objects as well. In fact, sometimes if you're going around certain museums, you can even see early radiocarbon dates where they took a huge chunk of wood out of an object, and that is very often an early radiocarbon date. And in fact, sometimes it's a date used for the development of this process itself. So what Libby found while doing this work was that the half-life of radiocarbon, that is the time it takes half of half of the radioactive atoms in a sample to decay, was about 5,730 years. And since the invention of radiocarbon, archaeologists and associated disciplines have run hundreds of thousands of dates. And with this large corpus of dates, we're actually now able to use these to do more and more and more to understand what was going on in the past. And in fact, the analysis of radiocarbon dates is becoming an area of archaeological inference in its own right. So basically how it works and why radiocarbon is roughly consistent, the concentration of radiocarbon is roughly consistent in the atmosphere, is because it's continuously produced by the bombardment of the upper atmosphere by cosmic radiation, right? That introduces a neutron into nitrogen-14, right? That becomes carbon-14, right? That is then in the atmosphere, right? So you have carbon that's taken up into carbon dioxide, and that is respirated or breathed in and consumed by basically anything that is alive, right? So broadly speaking, nitrogen-14 is converted to carbon-14 in the upper atmosphere. Carbon-14 becomes CO2. Plants absorb CO2. Animals eat plants. Other animals eat animals that ate plants, taking this carbon into their bodies, right? Making us all a little bit radioactive, right? So here's what you have, that carbon atom coming down into the grass, going into the bison. Bison is radioactive. And when the bison dies, it becomes slightly less radioactive through time. When it stops respiring, right? When it has expired, that radioactivity slowly decreases through time at a known rate. And what's really cool about these radiometric dating methods is that there's very little you can do to actually change that process, right? It's a physical process, right? That's based on the sort of mechanics, the nuclear activities of atoms, right? The nuclear characteristics of atoms. So chemical changes don't make any difference, right? So you can change the chemical properties of those materials, but as long as you don't take any of that carbon out of there preferentially, right, it's going to stay there. So chemical alteration doesn't change radiocarbon. So burning doesn't change it, right? The leaching of bones doesn't necessarily change it. Use those things that can get messed up and gets a little bit complicated. But the take-home message is what can be dated: charcoal and wood, netting, unburned plant materials, bones, teeth, literally anything that was once alive, anything that respired, which is useful, but also presents some serious limitations. I think we could all agree that it would be a lot easier if we could actually date a stone tool, which people ask about all the time. Oh, are you going to radiocarbon date that arrowhead? Well, no, we're not, because it was never alive. It's very ancient rock. Even if it would be much easier if we could. Well, so early radiocarbon dating, right? So early instruments were not very sensitive. It functionally it boiled down to basically being a fancy Geiger counter. And because of that, the age ranges were large, and it required really, really large samples. So archaeologists, when this technique came out, and in fact, many of the early radiocarbon dates run in the 1950s. You hear apocryphal stories, perhaps, of archaeologists showing up with like a handful of carbon and be like, is this enough? So it often resulted in archaeologists needing to use mingled samples, just scrounging whatever they could out of an archaeological site, which confounded the age range problem of the lack of sensitivity of the instruments. And functionally, these instruments only measured radioactive decay from radiocarbon. So this is one of the early instruments that Libby used, called this the anti-coincidence counter. So what it has is a circular arrangement of Geiger counters. Here, let's say laser pointer. Here, right, surrounded by thick metal shields on all sides to reduce the amount of background radiation, giving an erroneous signal. Again, not very sensitive. Right? This began to change in the 1980s with the development of accelerator mass spectrometry dating, AMS dating. Many of you have probably heard of this technique, or at least heard of this acronym. And this uses a particle accelerator as opposed to a Geiger counter. And this is a big deal. In fact, some people have called this radiocarbon 2.0 because of how much it actually changed the discipline, right? That developed in the 1980s, and it's actually counting proportions of carbon isotopes, right? So rather than relying upon the emission of radiation from radioactive decay from carbon-14, using the various physical properties of different weights of atoms, right? It can separate those out while in a plasma state, right? And point those atoms at different detectors and actually count them almost individually, right? And it can then count proportions of isotopes, not just carbon-14, but carbon-13, which is important for environmental reconstruction, compared to carbon-12, the normal isotope of carbon, right? Again, a really, really big deal, because mostly because it's more precise, but especially because it requires only a very small sample of carbon, right? This is a very, very big deal because it fundamentally changed what archaeologists could date, especially when you're going back into deeper time and carbon is less and less common on archaeological sites. So now, you might be able to get away with, depending on the lab, 0.5 gram, as opposed to many multiple grams of carbon for a standard radiocarbon date. And combining that with a more precise analysis, right? Going from standard deviations of, say, 300 years, 12,000 years ago, to 30 years, 12,000 years ago. Now, what do I mean by standard deviation? Well, reading radiocarbon dates, right? So all chronometric dates, radiocarbon and otherwise, represent age ranges, right? They're not like the year, like a tree ring date often is. Rather, it represents a probabilistic statement of where we might expect that age range to fall. So this is illustrating how radiocarbon dates are usually presented: a number, in this case 25,000, plus or minus some other number, in this case 500. right? So that's the mean, 25,000 is the mean, the average date based on that probability. Whereas the standard deviation is how wide that probability distribution actually is. How many years on one side or the other, about 63% of the probability on either side falls, right? And then before present, BCE or other dating conventions, usually given in BP, years before present, rather than conversion to BC. Depends on your dating convention. So what this means, oh, I got that number wrong. Sorry, 68.2% chance that the sample dated between 24,500 and 25,500, 1,000-year range. And that's only 68.2% of the probability. If you wanted to be more precise, that age range gets bigger, right? And it's still just a probability that that date falls somewhere in there, right? Not any one specific spot in there. So there's a lot of slop in radiocarbon dates. And I think people often forget this, that they really are probability statements. You always have to have in the back of your mind that you're talking about probabilities, not just a number. People tend to fixate on the mean, and that's not really a good idea. There's a lot of information left out if you're just focusing on the mean, right? They are probability statements. They look like this, right? So on either side, this is just a standard normal distribution, right? A very classic bell-shaped curve, if you will. And this is what I was talking about with the probability. So the probability, right? Density function here, and these are standard deviations: 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, etc. And most radiocarbon dates are given at 1 standard deviation, 1 sigma. For point of fact, physicists want a 5 sigma proof of concept. So that would be 5 standard deviations out from the mean. So archaeologists are working with, usually working with somewhat less precise data. Now, some archaeologists will work with 2 standard deviations, which captures over 90% of the variability, but most tend to talk about just 1 standard deviation. Just something to keep in mind, right? So with that in mind, in terms of radiocarbon, there are important limits to keep in mind, right? 1, can't date things that weren't alive. You have to use it on organic materials, or at least carbonate materials. Sorry. Had a tick. So, and it's destructive. Whatever you submit as your sample is gone forever, right? For accelerator mass spectrometry dates, they're actually going to turn that into a plasma. They're literally going to burn it up and strip those atoms of their electrons and fire it through a particle accelerator. It is gone. That is what to say it is gone. And it does require somewhat large samples, even with AMS dating, right? You can't necessarily date one tiny piece of carbon in a soil column. It probably won't work. So you do need reasonably large samples, even if they're much smaller than they used to be. And it cannot be used to date anything older than 50 to 60, maybe 65,000 years, depending on who you ask and which lab you're using. But that's pushing things out to the limit. And sometimes even before that, you'll hit what's called an infinite date. There's just simply not enough carbon-14 left in a sample to produce a meaningful analysis. Henry, I know you don't care about radiocarbon. Sorry, my cat. He's not a fan of radiocarbon. Now, with these things in mind, right, I think it's important to illustrate what people are doing with radiocarbon dating now, especially with the advent of cheap computing power. And one of the major paths forward with radiocarbon dating recently is Bayesian radiocarbon date analysis, right? And fundamentally speaking, it's a way of working with probabilities, which radiocarbon dates themselves all are. Every radiocarbon date you have is a probability statement, and just working with just the means as a number doesn't work well. And it really wasn't until the development of relatively accessible, cheap, high-powered computers that we were able to work with these in a meaningful way. Even if actually the theorem that it's based upon was developed actually in 1763. And it's this. It's read as the probability of A being true given the probability of B is true, which is then the probability of B being true given the probability of A being true, times the probability of A being true divided by the probability of B being true, right? Published in 1763. Does that sound crazy? Yeah, it hurts my brain too. Most people don't really deal with these by hand. In fact, it's virtually impossible once you reach even a middling level of complexity. There was a little work with this in the 1980s, but really before people got a hold of computers that could really just plug and chug, just do a lot of computation really, really easily. It wasn't possible to do these types of analyses with radiocarbon dates, even if you wanted to. Since the development of cheap computing, we've been able to do a lot more. And what I think perhaps the biggest one is radiocarbon date calibration. Now, as I alluded to before, radiocarbon years and calendar years are not the same, right? So what we have here, this thin blue line here is if radiocarbon years and calendar years were exactly the same, right? And what you can see down here, this is actually, this thicker blue line is radiocarbon years, as you can see, roughly speaking, as we go further back in time, it deviates more and more and more from the calendar year line. Generally speaking, that radiocarbon years tend to trend towards being read as younger. So a radiocarbon date of 10,000 years before present actually is usually around 12,000 years old, right? And so again, that's sort of changing our understanding of what radiocarbon dates mean. Now, if you zoom in on this thicker blue line and why it looks like that in this curve, you end up seeing something like this. This is a radiocarbon calibration curve for between 2300 and 3200 years BP, or Cal BC in this case, right? And this is also a probability density line, right? You can see it gets thicker and thinner and sometimes goes down, and there are reversals. And what this has the nasty property of doing is taking your nice smooth radiocarbon date with its standard-ish deviation or standard distribution and smearing it out across that radiocarbon curve into a probability density function that looks more like this, right? It takes something that is pretty easy to understand, even if it's a probability statement, into something that's a total mess, which is unfortunate. And you can see here, this is one standard deviation. If you were to spread two standard deviations of probability out, it just gets even messier and uglier, right? So it becomes even harder to deal with. Fortunately, as I'll talk about in a minute, when you start dealing with, when you start using more and more and more computing power, you can actually begin to deal with this in a more meaningful way. And it actually in a more quantitatively rigorous way, analytically rigorous way as well. So moving forward, when we're considering radiocarbon dates and selecting them, right, we need to be really cognizant about what we are actually dating. And when we're talking about plants and animals, what we're actually dating is, in fact, the death of that organism, right? So that doesn't usually make much difference for animals that don't tend to live very long. But when you're talking about materials that are derived from certain plants, especially trees, it becomes a really, really big problem. In fact, so much so that this is called the old wood problem. And this is something you need to be really cognizant of when you're selecting radiocarbon dates, right? Because you can imagine, this is an extreme example. This is a bristlecone pine in California, right? They can live to be 5,000 years old and then can stand dead for many years after that, right? or in the American Southwest, right? Junipers can do a similar thing. They can live to be many hundreds of years old, right? And then stand dead for centuries. In fact, the scientific name for the Utah juniper is Juniperus osteoperma, juniper of the everlasting bones, right? They sit on the landscape just there, right, for a long, long time. And there's something actually even more sort of insidious about it too, is when trees are growing, right, we know that they deposit their wood annually in rings in temperate environments. But what you don't necessarily always realize is that those interior rings, those are dead, right? That material is no longer respiring. It's only the exterior part of the tree that's still alive, right? So there's no more new carbon being deposited in the center of a tree. So if you have a tree that's 300 years old and it sits for 200 years on the landscape and you somehow date the middle of that tree, right? That date is 500 years off, right? 500 calendar years off. So it can be a really, really big problem, especially in cold places or arid places, and especially arid places. In fact, I've read a couple of studies of folks working in the Atacama Desert of Chile, where actually ancient hunter-gatherers went and gathered wood that was preserved in the desert, in the driest place in the world, right? They burned that wood, but when they burned it, it was 15,000 years old. So depending on, mostly not a problem in New England, although it could be. White pines can live to be 300 to 500 years old. If you somehow dated the middle of charcoal from a white pine, you'd be way off. But in other parts of the world, this is particularly germane, especially cold or dry. Okay. So how do you address this problem? Well, the simplest way to go about it is really make sure you're looking for short-lived samples, right? Now that with the development of accelerator mass spectrometry dating, right, we can date sometimes just a couple of seeds, right? Something that we know was produced and died in a single season. It represents a single year. If not seeds, then twigs, small things that we wouldn't expect to be very old, nor would we expect them to persist for very long on the landscape, right? This is important to keep in mind. If you're taking these big hunks of charcoal, if you happen to get those, they could be very old, especially depending on where you work. Bone is also another good option in some places, although keeping in mind that bone tends to be more subject to contamination than actual carbonized plant material. But again, what we're really thinking about here, the underlying thought process is that these things can't really be very old, right? That the seeds are not that did not live 500 years. The bison did not live 1,000 years, right? It might have lived, 20, and that's fine. That's less of an issue, right? So something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, depending upon where you work, is something called the reservoir effect. And this is that while terrestrial plants and animals are taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, water bodies also absorb a lot of atmospheric carbon and hold on to it. And they can hold on to it for a really, really, really long time. And sometimes they're uptaking carbonates from geologic sources. This is carbon that has no radiocarbon in it whatsoever, so it can give the appearance of being very, very, very old. Right? As an extreme example showing how this process can unfold, right? This is now a very famous shot of ostensible human footprints in White Sands, New Mexico, that have been dated by dating aquatic plants to 25,000 years ago. Now, following that original study, a group went back into a herbarium, I believe at Harvard University, and gathered some rupia seeds that were some of the aquatic plant seeds, these rupia seeds, that were gathered from that very same playa in the 1930s. And that's important because it was pre-atomic bomb. I should mention the atomic bomb really messes up radiocarbon dates for the future. Fortunately, those of us that work way in the past have to worry about that less. Anyway, they gathered pre-bomb rupia seeds, right, and dated them and found that they were seeds that were collected in 1930, radiocarbon dated to 7,000 years old. right? It's a very, very, very extreme reservoir effect, right? Because that plant was uptaking dead carbon, non-radioactive carbon out of the water. And that carbon was very, very, very ancient. And so the combination of that old and young carbon actually gave the appearance that the seeds were 7,000 years old when they were 70 years old, right? So that's a particularly extreme example, but working here in New England, this is something that you have to keep in mind, because there are New England and other coastal areas, because some things that you find pretty frequently in archaeological sites, because they preserve well, can have extreme reservoir effects, or at least large reservoir effects, notably shells. So your marine mollusks are taking up carbon from the ocean. And of course, the ocean is a really dynamic environment. And so carbon is ebbing and flowing. The reservoir effects are different in different parts of the ocean, because some ocean waters are older that were absorbing atmospheric carbon more recently than other parts of the ocean. So it's highly dynamic and it changes through time, right? So even on the coast of Maine, at the end of the last ice age, at the end of the Pleistocene, you're looking at reservoir effects that are over 500 years, right? So you date a shell and it's 500 years too old. Certainly something to keep in mind when you're trying to hone in on a really specific time period and selecting radiocarbon dates, which is kind of a bummer, because shells are almost rocks, and they preserve really well, but they are really, really challenging to get super accurate radiocarbon dates. They'll get you in the ballpark, but they won't actually get you there. And with these new radiocarbon methods, especially Bayesian inference, that can be a challenge, because it can throw off what we're trying to understand about people, right? And when I'm talking about Bayesian inference, usually you'll see it in an article presented something like this. Don't blame me for this ugly graphic. I wouldn't choose necessarily to display it this way, but this is what Oxford University wants it to look like. So we're going to blame Oxford University for this. But what this is showing is calibrated radiocarbon dates arrayed from a site through time. So honing in on something, in this case, a phase change. We noticed something different in the archaeological record, and we want to know when that happened, right? You can model that using computer technology, using a variation of Bayes' theorem, right, to understand when an event in the past may have happened, and really hone in on that, even if you can't date that exact happening itself, right? You can get close by modeling that with computers. And what this is actually showing, I think, is really cool, for those that know, is the analysis of the transition from Neanderthals to modern human technology in Europe, right? So what the scholars in this particular study did was gather a bunch of radiocarbon dates through an archaeological sequence, through a stratigraphic sequence, right? And run them through a Bayesian analysis. And so while we might blame Oxford for making relatively hard to interpret graphics, they have been nice enough to provide us with the software to work with dates without being a math genius, right? And what this is showing here, right? You have Chattel-Perronian technology, that's usually considered to be Neanderthal technology, phasing into the Proto-Aurignacian. So right here, based upon this, is when this study would say that was the transition to between Neanderthals and modern humans, right? So you can really hone in on a specific event, which is really, really, really useful. You can also do this across landscapes, right? Really helpful, right? You can start to really test some hypotheses that you might have had. I think X happened at thus and such a time. And you can test that. And you can see it, you can actually test if your inferences are supported by the data or not supported by the data, which is really useful. Sort of can keep you honest, if you will. Right? But what we're also doing now, a number of archaeologists, is using summed probability distributions, right? That's taking all of those probabilities and using computational power to sum them up. You might imagine that a radiocarbon date actually looks, a probability density distribution looks something like an onion, right? You're like slicing up an onion, and then if you have a bunch of onions, you stack them on top of each other, right? And so different areas get taller, different areas get lower. So if you have more radiocarbon dates from a particular time period, right, you can see that. If you have less radiocarbon dates from a particular time period, you can see that. This is actually a This is a graphic from some of my own work, and this is showing radiocarbon dates, human-associated radiocarbon dates from northern New England, and at the end of the last ice age. And you can see there's a robust sequence of radiocarbon dates from around 13,000 to around 11,700. But just after 11,700, there's almost no radiocarbon dates. That might be telling us something, right? Because it happens to correspond to this Greenland temperature anomaly, right? Just after the end of the Younger Dryas, a paucity of archaeological radiocarbon dates. It might mean that populations are really low, or it might mean that archaeologists are really bad at finding sites that date to this period, but something is going on here, right? And I think that that's really, really cool as well. But it gets better. If you happen to integrate radiocarbon dates and GIS, you can start looking at population dynamics through time, right? And start to figure out where different things happened at different times and places, right? So in this case, talking about Mesolithic and Neolithic population dynamics in Europe, so right, the transition from foraging to food production and where it happened and how. You can start really looking at some pretty heavy duty anthropological questions just based upon radiocarbon dates. Same with population dynamics, population growth and declines in certain areas, right? So again, you're really looking at these big anthropological questions using sometimes just radiocarbon dates, carefully selected radiocarbon dates, because the better your dates are, the better your analyses are, right? It's a classic, it's a classic problem. You have to start with better data, or if you have bad data, your results are going to be bad. If you have good data, your results are going to be better, right? You still have to do the analyses properly, but having more better dates is going to help you do a better job. And that's why I think that it's really important to be cognizant now more than ever of the radiocarbon dates or the materials that you're selecting, to try to make sure that your dates are as good as possible, so that when you or other archaeologists try to answer these broader questions beyond just a single site, right, we're working with better materials. We can make more robust inferences. Right? It's really cool, but it's kind of like a big responsibility, right? So when you're selecting materials to date, right, you want to make sure that your samples are associated with the event that you want to date, right? So usually for archaeologists, that is when people did something, not when a juniper in the southwestern desert died. You want to know what people did, not what trees did, right? So you got to beware of the old wood problem and emphasize short-lived samples, and understand what local factors may impact date accuracy and precision, right? Such as local reservoir effects on often marine mollusks, but also plants and animals that might be getting old carbon from somewhere. Also, certain areas there is increased problems with contamination of bone and other samples, but you kind of have to understand those locally, but you do need to be cognizant of them, right? So emphasizing twigs, single season samples like corn cobs, things like that, right? Right. So a way to ensure that, but to ensure your samples are associated with an event you want to date, this is important archaeologically when you're in the field, right? Because what you want to date, again, is when humans did a thing, right? Not when there was a forest fire. So in the past, there was a pattern of dating dispersed charcoal in archaeological sites. So like, just give me whatever you can get. Whatever I can get, I want to radiocarbon date that, it'll be close enough. We've moved beyond that, right? So now archaeologists interested in getting the best radiocarbon dates they can that date a specific event are really focusing on getting radiocarbon dates from archaeological features. In this case, it's a picture of a fire pit, right? We're pretty sure that this is anthropogenic in origin, and the artifacts associated with that fire pit may likely date to this period, right? Or date to when this fire was lit and burned, right? So rather than dating dispersed charcoal, which might date a natural event like a forest fire, it's becoming more important to actually emphasize dates from features, to make sure that your dates are actually dating what you want, not some natural environment, right? unburned bone in an archaeological site is also an excellent alternative if those bones can be robustly associated archaeologically with the event you want to date, the human occupation of that site. Right? So unburned bone can be an excellent alternative, but not in New England. Unfortunately, New England is really, really bad. Bone doesn't tend to preserve for very long, but this is somewhat controversial. Burned bone can actually work pretty well. There used to be a lot of concern about burned bone not producing robust radiocarbon dates, that there was something during the combustion process that perhaps the bone took up carbon from some of the combustion materials or something like that. It's been found to not be as big a problem as it might be. I think some people are still a little suspicious of calcined bone or burned bone dates, but it is a good alternative, especially in New England where unburned bone is really unlikely to be found. Right? So I would say don't write off calcined bone dates just because you heard somebody say that they don't work well. They work pretty darn well. Even if somebody might give you a little bit of a suspicious look if you come at them with a calcined bone date, but that's just a historical contingency. Now, and then finally, consider reservoir effects, New England and elsewhere. So I wanted to put this all together with an example from my own work that I was recently confronted with. Well, not so recently, about a year and a half ago, I was down on the north coast of Peru, and my colleague and I were exploring, and we came across a gigantic shell mitten that the locals had been kind enough to drive through with a bulldozer, which presented us with a 3-meter tall exposure of marine shells on the south coast of Peru. Now, taking into account local effects, especially local reservoir effects, it's pretty well known that the reservoir effects along the south coast of Peru are really, really large, especially when you get back closer and closer and closer to the Pleistocene, closer to the Ice Age, right? So dating shells there is actually a really big challenge. Your dates might be off by a lot, right? Now, what was really awesome about this particular site, the site of Playa Huela Grande, is you have all these shells, but they're all mixed in with wood. But there's always a but, right? There's charcoal of different sizes throughout this column as well. And each one of these represents an individual carbon sample, right? So plucking individual pieces of carbon out of that profile, but not just any carbon, little tiny twigs, right? Because here in this location, a potential problem is that large wood could actually sit on the surface for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a very, very dry place. Not as dry as the hyper core of the Atacama with the 15,000-year-old wood, but you could still have really, really old wood, even if it was relatively small, only say 5 centimeters in diameter. That could be quite ancient, many hundreds of years old. There's also the problem of driftwood on the coast, etc., right? So keeping in mind these different localized factors and just applying those basic heuristic models of short-lived samples, short-lived terrestrial samples from this primarily marine deposit, right? And in doing that, we actually found that these basal dates on short-lived samples produced a radiocarbon date of well over 9,000 years old, plus or minus about 30. So it's a really good radiocarbon date. But there's a lot of ways this could have gone wrong if I wasn't being super cognizant of what I was doing and the potential pitfalls of dating various materials in this hyperarid environment. So to put it all together and to recap, right? Accelerator mass spectrometry has fundamentally changed radiocarbon dating from requiring really large, often commingled samples to really being able to target and do those dates on a couple of seeds from an archaeological feature, right? So this isn't to cast aspersions on our predecessors. It's rather that they just simply didn't have the technology to do these really precise dates, right? And because we've been running radiocarbon dates for decades now, we now have hundreds of thousands of them from archaeological sites. And through computational methods and Bayesian analysis, right, we're able to really work with them for the first time, right? So we're actually really able to get in and work with these large corpus of radiocarbon dates in mathematically rigorous ways that simply wasn't possible even 10 years ago, right? This is revolutionizing archaeological inference in the analysis of radiocarbon dates. In fact, some folks basically just do the analysis of radiocarbon dates as their archaeological research, right? It's really, really, really powerful. It's not without pitfalls, and it shouldn't, and you should always treat these analyses critically, but it's really, really cool stuff that's going on, and it's really enabling us to ask new and different questions and test some of our previous assumptions, right? And start to suss out or really quantify what were previously sort of impressionistic patterns in radiocarbon date frequency by really being able to put them all together. But this really just makes the selection of the material to radiocarbon date more important. For example, a lot of these analyses, when you're doing these higher level or radiocarbon date analyses, researchers that are working with those dates will simply throw out radiocarbon dates with standard deviations over 300 years, sometimes over 200 years, right? That's just too broad an age range to be meaningful. It doesn't mean that the mean of that date isn't mostly correct, but the probability distribution is so broad that it's hard to talk about anything on a temporal scale that's meaningful to people, right? And also, you want to make sure that you are, in fact, dating the event that you want, because otherwise it can throw off your analyses one way or the other. And the more really good modern radiocarbon dates we can get, the better any future analyses will be, right? And these techniques are evolving really, really quickly, which I think emphasizes even more the importance of really being cognizant of what you're dating and trying to do the best job you can to select a radiocarbon date that is really doing what you want it to do. And with that, I will wrap up and take questions. I'm sure I managed to neglect something. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. All right. Thanks so much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathaniel. It's a real reminder to me that it's been about 20 years since I had an introductory lecture to radiocarbon dating. And, a real interesting reflection on how much has changed.
It's really fast. It's happening really, really fast.
It's really fast, and it's so exciting I like the way you put it in kind of human terms there, but I remember the excitement when we were starting to have the potential to get back radiocarbon dates that were shorter than human lifetimes.
Right, exactly.
Right. It changes the way, it's not just how old is this site anymore. It's what is the sequence, what was happening, what was changing, and when. It's really
that's the crazy thing about AMS dating is when you I'm always flabbergasted with getting back a radiocarbon date that's like 12,000 years plus or minus 50, right? Like, that's crazy. It's awesome.
I think another thing again, in a long time since I had an introductory lecture, but thinking about some of the practicalities of doing this, something I've been struck by is the accessibility of this technology. And you talked about sample size, but there's of course price as well. And those early radiocarbon, it wasn't just that they needed a shopping bag full of charcoal. It was that it was an unbelievable expense to actually do the thing.
Yeah.
And I'm really struck by how, I remember the early, perhaps not the earliest days of AMS dates, but I remember working on projects where people were like, well, the AMS dates they're getting now are amazing, but we can't afford those.
Yeah.
So we're gonna do 10 regular dates instead.
Right.
And
the
people
cost of an AMS date is now dropped precipitously as well.
Yeah, it is really the standard now. So what are prices like these? I'm just in terms of informing students, and you're perhaps more up on this than I am. What would you say is an average price for a radiocarbon date these days?
An AMS date with really good pre-treatment, $350.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, so it's pretty accessible, especially for almost any compliance project.
Yeah.
right? That's not what's going to blow your budget. That's not what's going to blow your budget.
Well, wonderful. I'm not sure, we haven't had anything in the chat. But does anyone else have a question that they'd like to add to things?
No, there's no way I did that good a job. I know I didn't. I caught myself several times like
Well, folks have time to ruminate, and I suppose they have our email addresses if they want to follow up as we puzzle through radiocarbon. But thanks so much to everyone for coming. The Friday and a holiday weekend was a bit of a roll of the dice, or a holiday weekend in the States, I should say. It was a bit of a roll of the dice for hosting an event. So a small crowd, but thanks so much for showing up. And we're still working on an ESAF YouTube page to publicize these things more widely. But if we have done a recording, we don't know when it will be up online. But for those of you who are here, if you'd like a copy, please feel free to shoot me an email. So yeah, wonderful. Well, with that, thank you so much, Nathaniel. And again, as questions come up, please keep in touch with us. But this has been great, and it'll be a great resource going forward. So thank you so much.
Well, yeah, thanks y'all for being here. I really appreciate your attention, and thanks for inviting me, Arthur, and Gabe, who's not here.
Yeah, Gabe.
We'll cast aspersions on Gabe for not being here.
Suspicious holiday. Yeah.
Indeed.
Wonderful. All right.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Yep. Take care.